be asking who should make decisions about how data is used. Elizabeth Denham is the UK Information Commissioner, where her work is focused on increasing people's understanding, trust, and confidence about how data about them is being used. This is something that has been raised by many delegates at the conference. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from her. Elizabeth was appointed chair in 2018 of the Global Privacy Assembly, which aims to provide global leadership when it comes to data protection and privacy. So please welcome Elizabeth Denham, CBE.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Maggie, for that warm introduction. I am very excited to join you virtually this afternoon. And I know there's been a lot of discussions about the use of data throughout today, but the ICO's work as both regulator of transparency, freedom of information, and data protection sits comfortably alongside the work of the ODI. There is a shared passion for transparency wherever possible and a shared recognition of the value of data and the benefits that come from sharing data. But the shared principle that I want to focus on this afternoon is trust. And in particular, trust as an imperative of the type of innovations being discussed today. And trust is necessary for that innovation to reach its full potential. And listening to some of the discussions today, I'm hearing a tone of positivity in the face of challenge. So yes, our world is very different than it was 12 months ago. And I think this time last year, few of us would have expected and few of us would have welcomed state track and trace systems or needing to provide personal information when you get your hair done or when you pop into a cafe. And I heard today about concerns of what comes next. So these are unpredictable times, but I hear positive notes too. And there's an often quoted line from Sun Tzu that says, in the midst of chaos, there is opportunity. And that opportunity has already come through today's sessions. What the pandemic has brought is a massive acceleration in the uptake of digital services that would otherwise have taken years. And this uptake isn't just about people using video calls to keep in touch with friends and families or new platforms to join conferences like this. We have seen a change in attitude. People are facing a threat to their health, and they feel compelled to accept approaches that they would have been less sure of otherwise. But it does feel like people are demanding innovation rather than organizations having to drag them kicking and screaming or persuade them to accept change. Matt Hancock said that 99% of GP practices now offer video consultations, and that compares to less than 10% a year ago before the pandemic, and attributed that change to public demand. And as the minister touched on this morning in the opening, this change in attitude is also reflected in positive media coverage and the positive impact that data is having on the country's response to the pandemic. And we also hear that people are thirsty for more evidence and more data. in my office, we are able to support work to share information between public authorities and many other agencies. Take supermarkets, for example. And that data sharing between public authorities and supermarkets was in aid of getting food supplies to people who were shielding during COVID. And that example shows too the greater appreciation of what data can offer, something that we've seen on a greater scale around the work to track the spread of the virus nationally. And it feels like the ODI's encouragement of an open, fair, trustworthy data ecosystem has never been more relevant, has never been more important. And the trust aspect is absolute. So it feels like a time of change, not just directly through the pandemic, but in race relations too, and society's attitude to help and support others. None of us would have chosen the winds of change that have blown through this year. But that doesn't mean that we can't adjust our sails to make the most of them. Today, I want to talk about how we can encourage that change and the crucial role trust plays. I want to talk about the role regulation plays in that innovation. And I want to talk a little about the areas where I see data ethics and social inequality overlap. So let me start by going back to that example of data sharing between public authorities and supermarkets. So with the ICO's advice and guidance, that data sharing allowed supermarkets to understand who needed delivery spots at a time when demand for those spots was outstripping supply. And that's an example that illustrates some of the challenges that come in answering who decides how organizations can share personal information. The public authorities had to consider whether the data sharing was appropriate, whether it was lawful, and whether they were confident that the information wouldn't be misused by the supermarkets. And the supermarkets had to be confident in the accuracy of the data. And most fundamentally, there had to be consideration of the people whose data was being shared, including considerations of transparency and consent and fairness. We disregard people's concerns about their privacy at our peril. And that's because what sits at the core of all of those considerations is trust. The supermarket data sharing innovation worked because it had people's trust. It made sense. It was fair. It was reasonable. And that's crucial because people's personal data is just that. It's personal. And so it rightly provokes strong reactions. And I see that firsthand in my role. I've spoken to parents who have seen the devastating effects of how their children's data was used to predict what content their children might engage in, used to push inappropriate content in their direction. Self-harm comes to mind. I've heard how the Metropolitan Police gangs matrix could change the life of a young man wrongly labeled on a database, which was then shared with other authorities. Or the young adults I spoke to who had spent their childhoods in care and now wanted access to their records, their personal data, as they tried to piece together the memories of their upbringing. And so we cannot, we must not underestimate how much people care about their personal data. Any innovation that relies on personal data must take the time to make sure that is taking people with them, that it has public trust. And that's not a conflict. I agree strongly with the minister's comments earlier that protecting people's rights and encouraging economic growth are not in conflict. And trust is central to that, giving people confidence to support innovation and growth. We have to take the time to explain to people what is happening to their data, explaining why an app needs their data, where their data is going, how an algorithm works, and what AI processing is going on. And when we ask who decides how we can use personal data, our first answer must be the people whose data it is. The relationship between trust in data use and innovation has long been recognized. Data protection law was born in the 1970s out of a concern that the potential of emerging technology would be lost if society didn't embrace innovation. And that concern remains relevant now. We all still have work to do to encourage trust in innovative data use. The law that my office regulates is part of that, reassuring people that they can support innovation, safe in the knowledge that there are checks and balances in place to protect them, with a strong independent regulator who has their back. And for businesses, regulation means a fair marketplace where corner cutting or deceitful actions of rival companies do not go unchecked. So the result is strong data protection law and an active regulator to ensure that those rules are followed. And so when we ask who decides how we can use personal data, we must consider the role of the regulator as acting on behalf of the people whose data is processed. I want innovation to succeed, and I think we are achieving that. As a modern regulator, my approach is very much focused on working alongside organizations, helping them to make changes and improvements to comply with the law, to reduce mistakes and misuse of people's data. Working to get it right up front results in better outcomes for businesses, for government, and for people. Helping businesses get privacy right is the work that my office is largely set up to deliver. About 3/4 of my staff work on this kind of support and advice. I'm thinking here about our report on the extraction of mobile data from the phones of sexual assault victims, which set out the expectations for police who have accepted our solution as a sensitive and empathetic way forward. We've worked with credit reference agencies to improve their handling of people's personal information. And our website is a treasure trove of guidance on data sharing, on the use of AI, on data security and anonymization. There is so much information on there. But the headlines are all about the fines. And our fines are important when serious failings happen. But this collaboration, this kind of advice, these kinds of formal opinions are really the bread and butter of the ICO's work. And I'll flag our sandbox work here because our sandbox really helps organizations using personal data to develop innovative and new services. It's already been used for great effect. For instance, in projects that are looking to use data to support student mental health at universities, or a scheme looking to detect fraud by bringing together pseudonymized data from a range of financial institutions. So if you're working on something innovative in data, I'd urge you to look at the details of our sandbox program on our website. You may be a candidate for the sandbox. And of course, central to the advice that we offer through our sandbox is an emphasis on trust. There are clear requirements in law around trust, from the role of transparency to the importance of fairness. And that fairness aspect feels particularly important in the context of the very important conversations that we've heard in 2020. Personal data informs decisions that can shape where someone lives, whether they get a bank loan, how much products cost. It can shape whether somebody is offered a product or service at all. And as we saw this last year, it can shape life-changing decisions like the A-level results. And if those decisions suffer from bias, or if they're rooted around assumptions and inferences based on people's race or their gender, then there's a good chance that data protection rules are not being followed. This is an area where data ethics and societal inequality overlap. And when it comes back to trust, when we ask who decides how we can use personal data, simply saying people is too general and it's too simple an answer. Or to put it another way, are there enough voices being heard about how personal data is used? And that's a question I've had to consider within my own office. Like any regulator, consultations are a big part of what we do to make sure that our advice and guidance is practical, that it's understandable, that it's effective. Our children's code, the Age Appropriate Design Code, which aims to protect children's data within an internet that wasn't necessarily designed with youngsters in mind, is a good example. And to draft that code, we collaborated with an enormous number of stakeholders, from parents and children's groups to child psychologists to app developers to the gaming industry and web designers. But with such an important piece of work, there's always a thought of whether we could have done more. Could we have done more? We wanted to involve the people who the code was aimed at ultimately benefiting. But did we do enough to understand the different perspectives that Black and minority ethnic groups may have? Did we consider how the experience of websites are different for children with disabilities? So this questioning of ourselves, asking whether we've been truly consultative, is important for all of us. And I think all of us would agree that the talk we hear of public consultation from organizations doesn't match the proper public voice that could inform the design of final products. We need to work harder as regulators, as innovators, to reach out to those whose experience can inform a truly representative consultation. And maybe we need to approach these conversations not through the prism of legislation, but through the prism of trust. So I'll draw my comments to a close there, and I'll be happy to take questions. But I wanted to conclude with a brief reflection. 2021 will be a new start. So much has happened this year, from the pandemic to Black Lives Matter movement to the UK leaving the EU. It feels like we could build on this change and challenge and find opportunity. We can find opportunity through growing positivity towards digital innovation, in the realization of the value of data sets that exist within the public and the private sector, of the gradual acceptance of the value of sharing this data, and crucially, the growing acceptance that such innovations that lead to benefits that can be shared by all, data for good, privacy, equality. So 2021 can be a year of opportunity, but none of that is possible. None of that is sustainable without trust. Society relies on trust, commerce relies on trust, government relies on trust. Data is no different. Trust is imperative. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And we've got a number of questions here for you, which I'm going to ask as quickly as possible. Kicking off with one from Dave Tarrant, who says, once the pandemic is over, how do we know that personal data that was shared is not going to be retained or used without lawful basis? Do we have to wait until that happens, or is there scope for audit and enforcement?
I'm happy to get that question, because I think one of the main concerns that we hear about the collection of data and the novel uses of data is what's the plan for the data at the end of the day? Is there going to be function creep? Is there connections of data behind the scenes that people won't know about? We've already announced that we will be auditing the test and trace program. We've announced that we'll be auditing any retention of data related to the app, and government has been notified that we will conduct these audits. And what the GDPR gave the ICO was the scope and the ability to go in and audit and assure people that somebody has their back and somebody is taking note, and we will take enforcement action if we find that there's been a contravention of the law.
Yeah, on the subject of people knowing that someone has got their back, one of my friends, Kate Bevan, said that she's continually irritated by how hard it is to sort of opt out of cookies, and how companies like Facebook continue to track you all around the web, seemingly with impunity. And I wonder whether is there not any possibility to do more and make sure that regulations have teeth?
I think everybody has a sense of weariness about the consent for cookies and whether or not that law and that regulation is effective, because it feels like if you don't accept, you're not going to get services. Those regulations, again, need to be looked at for their impact and their effectiveness. But when it comes to data protection and tracking around the internet, there are many investigations underway in the ad tech realm. For example, the Irish data protection regulator is responsible for the big tech companies that are based in Ireland when it comes to Europe. But when we are through the transition period and out the other side, then the ICO will have jurisdiction over the big companies in our own right, and we'll have the mandate to take action.
And then sadly, we've got, again, thank you so much for all of your questions. They're absolutely fabulous. I'm going to make the final one from Deborah Yates, who says, how closely should the regulator work with organisations like the Centre for Data Ethics, or is this work already happening?
There's we have a joint work program with the data ethics group. We have joint work programs with all of the other economic regulators. So there's definitely, we're not working in silos. And I think the Center for Data Ethics is doing important work and important studies. But again, they're an advisory group and not a regulator. So we each have our roles and responsibilities, but we're absolutely working together.
Well, Elizabeth, I sense that you have an incredibly busy time ahead of you. Thank you so much for joining us today and for giving your answers to some of the questions that we've been receiving in the chat. Thank you very much indeed.